Hello, how's everybody doing? Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Lenny, and I feel very privileged to have been asked to host this conversation through the Prince Edward Public Libraries today. I'm very excited. I'm a little intimidated, honestly, once everybody's face kind of popped out and there was like an audience. I'm used to speaking in front of people, but for some reason, I feel a little bit nervous. So hopefully that will translate into a great conversation. Before we start, I did want to acknowledge that we're on the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Wendat Huron peoples, and that we um, uh, benefit from the use of this land, living on this land, and that we're adjacent here with Tyendinaga territory being our neighbors across the bridge. And I encourage people to make connections and to meet people and to broaden our understanding of the history of this land and to take action to improve the lives of everybody who lives on it. So I'd like to acknowledge that and say that. Well, so here we have this afternoon Michelle Good, who is probably, I imagine, doesn't have a minute in her days right now, with everybody wanting to talk to her. So we're very lucky to have this time with her. Michelle, of course, just won the Governor General's Award for this book here, Five Little Indians, which was published in 2018, but obviously has legs. And I've read it recently when I found out and I was invited to do this talk. I had not read it before. And I think maybe part of my nervousness comes from just, talking to somebody who is such an incredible writer. And, as I did a little bit of research for this talk, just is such an inspiration. So I'd like to welcome Michelle to the screen without further ado. Hopefully that entrance works and Michelle will be able to join us here.
Hello.
Okay, hello. Hi, Michelle.
Don't be nervous. It's just
I
me.
know I should. I don't know. I mean, thank you. You're making me feel very comfortable and very welcome. So thank you so much. Yeah. All right. Well, I guess, can we start with the title of the book?
Sure.
Because I was like, I was nervous. I was like, oh my gosh, I'm going to have to say this title of this book. Yeah. And, you spent, my understanding is that it was 9 years in the making. And so it's obviously a conscious decision to make me say it. So like, can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So yeah. First of all, I'm sorry to correct you, but the book was actually published in 2020.
Okay.
In April 2020, and it that 2018 was when it won as a manuscript. It won the HarperCollins Best New Fiction Prize.
I see. Okay.
Yeah, and that's just like a contest that's operated by UBC and HarperCollins. So, but it was just released in 2020. But yes, it does have legs. So, Five Little Indians. It had many titles before I finally settled on that one. And me and a friend of mine, we went back and forth. And then one day it just came to me and I thought, oh yeah, that's it. And the reason that I loved it so much, well, first of all, is that I have the 5 protagonists. Secondly, during that time, I knew people would sort of go, oh, right. But during the time that the book starts, and a significant portion of the book takes place in the late 60s through the mid 70s before we start moving further into time. And that's what we were called. That's what we were called in those days. We were called Indians. And so it's consistent with the time frame of the novel. And the issue of nomenclature, whether we were being called Aboriginal or Indigenous or Native or Indian, is actually addressed in the prologue in a conversation between one of my characters' daughters and the infamous Clara. And so, but yeah, and the other aspect of that, so it was kind of a layered decision, is that terrible little ditty, one little, two little, three little Indians, right? Like I really wanted this cover to say, this book is about something that is fundamentally founded in racism. And so, it came to me just in a split second, and that was it.
Okay, well, it definitely is effective, and the whole book. I mean, it's a novel. It's a novel, but it's truth too, right? Like it's not. Um, it's these. I feel. I mean, reading it, I feel like you must have drawn on a lot of stories that you have heard, and uh, you know, uh, can you tell me a little bit about that choice to write a novel as opposed to writing a nonfiction book?
There's been a really substantial amount of work that's been done in an academic context, in a nonfiction context, in terms of people writing their own personal memoirs and their own story about residential school experience. But there hasn't been a ton of fiction about the residential school system, and certainly not about the post-school experience, which really is the focus of this book, is about how the impacts of the school created such a huge psychological, or a burden of psychological injury for these survivors to deal with. And I decided on fiction because you have such a broader latitude, if you will, with fiction. It can, and one of the things that I say often is that something need not be factual in order to be true. And so if you by choosing fiction, I had all the leeway in the world that I needed to tell those complete stories of these injuries, these harms, and why it's such a challenge for Indigenous people um, to resolve this history. Well, and it isn't history really; it's right now. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and that's I mean, I don't know how many people in the audience have read the book, or if for some people this is going to be an introduction and hopefully an inspiration to pick up the book and read it. Um, but when you talk about that kind of the impacts and the harms continuing to be done today, it goes right through to I guess the survivors telling their stories for the compensation hearings,
Mhm.
uh, and um, the injustices, you see them still there. You see the uncaring sandwich eating, and just the way that the tribunal judge is speaking to them. Like I mean, it's amazing how effective that is, and to show that line, because a lot of the conversations that are happening today in the wake of the um, discovery is not the right word, but because people have been telling us it for a long time and we just haven't been listening. But the I guess the confirmation and the uncovering of the graves, you know, people have been talking about this like the past, or about that like it's the past. But this isn't really a story about, like you say, the residential schools. It is more of a story about the afterwards, and you kind of touch on the foster program, the welfare program, the harms that have done. You touch on addiction um, and prostitution, sex work, like so.
Actually, that's not.
It,
It's not prostitution or sex work. Um, And I really struggled with how that part of the story was told, but it's really about the traumatized Maisie, that character, and a compulsion to revisit her trauma in an effort to try and resolve it. And that is a very common response to trauma. And we see the same thing in a different context with Kenny, who just keeps running and running and running, right, in an effort to, try to resolve the traumas that, they both characters experience there. Um, but this was something that I really, it was a very conscious choice to not write so much about what happened in the schools, but to lay the necessary foundation, and then to focus on what it was like for these kids to leave the school and to try, with no support, no, no training, nothing, and to try and make some kind of a life for themselves, and the challenges that are inherent in that, and that we see, even today in subsequent generations. Um, and that was in response to something that I have heard over and over and over again, in my life, not just as an intergenerational survivor myself, but in my work as an activist, in my work as a lawyer, in my just life. And that is, why can't they just get over it? Which is, you look at any of the kind of comments in newspaper stories and so on and so forth, and you see this really ubiquitous question. And it's so offensive. So I wanted to answer that question. I wanted to try to lay out these experiences for people so that they could, perhaps make a more human connection with, even if it's just the idea of survivors in a fictional context, and get a deeper sense of why these harms continue to work on survivors and subsequent generations.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that the book does an incredible job of linking the reader to these characters. I mean, just how they're painted in such a holistic way. And you can really see how, I grew up in Vancouver, and my parents didn't let me go downtown. Like they didn't want me to go downtown at all because it was a dangerous place. And, um, for people who maybe see poverty in their face when they're walking down the street, or they see um, uh, the harms and the legacies that the violence towards Indigenous people have carried through, like you say, and they see it, and you don't see what's behind that person who's on the street. You don't see, what's behind that person that's suffering. And um, the way that you treat these characters with such humanity, like it forces the reader to engage in that way. And I think it's amazingly done, and that you should actually consider changing your last name to Great.
Oh, well, it's funny because everybody wants to put an E on the end of my name, right?
Oh
Like,
yeah.
I don't know why, but everybody always says, what's your last name? Good. Is that with an E? No. And I just say good, like very good.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. But I mean, and it took you like uh it's weaved so beautifully, and it took you 9 years, uh and you came to it later in life too. Can you tell me a little bit about
Oh,
what that 9 years was like? Like, you had
oh, yeah.
I mean, that must have, it's a long time to be on one project like that. Yeah.
Yeah, it is, but it was the right amount of time, and I also really feel that the timing of the release of the book was actually very, very powerful. It was a very good time for it to be released. Um, but when I started, I went to the MFA program at UBC specifically to write this book, and so um, and so I went in 2011, and I was still running my own law firm at the time. and I was representing survivors, and I was, like, I think about this one time where I had 13 hearings in 20 days in 4 different geographical locations, right? So I was really, really busy. But that first fiction workshop at UBC, when I wrote the first paragraph, and it was about Kenny, and I immediately knew that I was going to need more characters in order for this um, uh, to really have the fullness of the story that I wanted it to have. And so, so I mean, I was living a life, I was working really hard, I was writing this book, and then in 2013, my son passed away, and he was my only child, and it was very difficult for me to do anything, much less to be very present with this book. But, it went through multiple drafts. It went, I had a couple of mentors look at it over time, and, they gave me some marvelous advice and support. And, it is a debut novel. What do I know about writing novels, right? So, so, but it was, this subject matter is something that is such a critical part of my own life, personally and professionally. And it's not the kind of book that you want to put out there if you're not quite certain that you've hit the mark. And that was something that I gave a lot of thought to, in terms of how each character expressed themselves, in terms of how they related to each other, in terms of, the structure, the braided narrative, and so on, because I wanted it to be just right. May the next novel not take 9 years.
Yeah, yeah. Yes, may the next novel not take 9 years, for sure. I guess, like, just to follow up on that you just said, Michelle, like, is there something that didn't make the cut, or that was like a really hard decision for you, where you were like, and you still wonder if maybe you should have done that thing differently, or like you were like, this is it, there's nothing
Yeah.
that
Well,
takes.
and I mean, it was really quite, yeah, like what I mentioned just a second ago about working with a mentor at one point, and I had another writer, very respected writer, and she did a manuscript evaluation for me, and she came back and she said, "This is a wonderful book." It's like, "Oh, thank you." And then she said, "But you need to cut the first 5 chapters." What? And what she was saying was not so much to get rid of all that material and all that work, right? But that's not where the story started, right? And it's a very common mistake for, an apprentice writer, which I was at the time, to what we call it writing in, where you're writing into the story. It's like a vocal warm up almost. And, so I did it. I just took those 5 chapters, set them aside, and then it took me a whole year to reintegrate what needed to stay in the book from those first 5 chapters into the rest of the book in, different places, different locations, different times. That was a huge, huge revision. And then, but by the time it got accepted at HarperCollins and I was assigned an editor to work with who was wonderful, we did very little, right? There was, really what we were working on was making sure, because you become a little blind to it after a while, and, making sure that there was, continuity and your dates work, and, that you haven't named somebody without getting appropriate, like Buffy St. Marie's song, Buffy gave permission to use that song, but you got to do those things, right? And,
Yes.
whether you can use the term Kit Kat or whether you need permission for that, all of those sort of more technical details about, putting the.
Oh, it was like there's a it was Pop-Tarts, like toaster pockets or something like that, right? It's like, they don't give you the.
Well, I wasn't about to go about, phoning Kellogg's and saying, "All right, can I use your."
Yeah.
I think I called them toaster tarts or something like that.
Yeah. That's right.
But all those kinds of little detaily things that you need to, you really need to address. And also the prologue. The prologue came last.
That's interesting.
Yeah, and the reason for it is that two editors that I was working with at HarperCollins suggested a prologue. I was a little bit resistant because I personally am not a big fan of prologues, right? But they said those first three chapters are so challenging. There's so much suffering in those first three chapters. I think readers are going to need a prologue so they know that there's something hopeful and wonderful that's going to happen as well, and they won't be traumatized themselves, right? They'll get through those first tough chapters. So yeah.
And in the prologue, like I think it's a matriarchy. Like you don't even say the names of the men in that prologue. You call them the driver or the, whatever.
And yeah.
The men. Yeah, exactly.
That's
And
interesting, but it wasn't intentional. And maybe that's just a subconscious thing because, of course, Mariah, the elder healer woman, is the woman who's running that, who's in charge of what's going on there. So it is a matriarchy. Yeah.
Yeah. I guess I wanted to ask, well, first of all, there was a question that came through on the chat about what are the books behind you there, and so I guess maybe we could take a minute and or if you have any other influences or books or authors that you obviously are doing work right now for something. So
well, I've been doing, like you said, I mean, I've been doing a lot of these kinds of interviews and conversations and so on. And lots of times people ask me, lots of times people say that my book has been a kind of a leaping off point for their own education about residential schools and Indigenous people in Canada and our experiences. So I've started recommending books, and so one of them is this. It's just a tremendous book. It's called A National Crime. It's by John S. Malloy, and it is one of the most amazingly detailed history of the entire residential school history in Canada, and where it started, how it's just an amazing book that even if you didn't read it cover to cover, you could open it anywhere and learn something new. The next one is it's called American Holocaust. It's an older book. It was written in 1996, I think. But what it does is it's also North American history, and it's about the decimation of Indigenous people through colonization. And it extrapolates and is able to arrive at some supportable numbers of the millions of Indigenous people that were killed, that died in North America as a result of colonialism. A Narrow Vision is a study of Duncan Campbell Scott, who was the superintendent of Indian Affairs and the overseer of residential schools, and responsible for terrible conditions in those schools. Seeing Red is I always forget, you get the title with the colon and a subtitle. Seeing Red, A History of Natives in Canadian Newspapers. And it's about the complicity of the media in promoting stereotypes of Indigenous people, negative stereotypes, and how they have continued that well into the 21st century. And then one of my favorites, Clearing the Plains by James Dashak. He's a historian out of the University of Manitoba. It started as his PhD history, and it's just the most amazing history of what once was the Northwest Territories. It's now Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and the colonial effort to clear the plains of us. Right. And so they're all just really excellent works in terms of understanding the bigger picture. And it will help people to reconsider what they think they know, both about the history of Indigenous people in North America and about the residential school legacy.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I guess another thing that I wanted to ask you about was your legal background and the experience of working with residential school survivors, and with Clara is a court worker in the book, becomes a court worker in the book, and um, talks about, some of the frustrations and how she is perceived. Like, is there some, like, you drew on your own experience for that part of it, and what are
Not
some?
really.
No, okay, well,
Because a court worker is a very different thing. And at that time, they basically sort of fulfilled the role of duty counsel, of getting people through their first appearances and then finding support for them. Um, I was very careful about uh, not really um, drawing on my experiences representing survivors, because I didn't want people to think I was telling their stories, which I
right.
wasn't. And um, but it was and it was a stunning experience, especially at the beginning when we were still doing these cases in litigation, so in open court, where survivors basically had under oh God, strenuous cross-examination, had to discuss the worst things that happened to them. And, this was before work was done on creating an alternative dispute resolution process, and then ultimately the settlement agreement and the independent assessment process. So, but those first years in litigation were really rough. They were very rough, because it was that adversarial aspect of litigation, right? Where
Hmm.
you're
Hmm.
trying to defeat people as opposed to achieve some degree of justice.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah.
Well, just on that note of justice and I guess accountability and, like, for perpetrators of crimes, um, is that something that, like, my understanding is that for the people that told their stories, the perpetrators who told their stories at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, they were somehow protected, or wouldn't be used against them, for prosecution or something. Like, do you think that there will be justice for
No,
those perpetrators? No. Is
as
that
far as I know, there have only been three um, uh, uh, abusers who ended up in jail out of all of these cases that came before the courts, and then um, before the tribunals, if you will.
Mhm,
And the criminal aspect of this is something that has never been properly investigated or resolved. It really hasn't, and it should be. It should be.
mhm,
These were
mhm,
just little kids, for goodness sake. You
mhm.
know,
I mean, that broke me, when Howie speaks that line, we were just kids, like, that broke me for sure, you know.
yeah. And people ask me if I had to do research and those kinds of things, but no, this is my lived experience. Virtually my entire cohort are residential school survivors. My mother married a non-Indigenous person and lost her legal Indian status, and so we weren't subject to the law that every Indigenous child or Indian child had to go to residential school. But my mom, my grandma, my aunties, my uncles, my friends, my cousins, my coworkers, everybody, so this is a history that I was immersed in from a fortunate point of view. But yeah, so
Yeah, yeah. um I I wonder if anybody in the audience, if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat, and we will try to get to them now. I'm just going to look at my list here that I wrote of notes, and see what else I wanted to ask you here. Um, yeah, I guess, like, I was also going to talk about, um, I don't know exactly who's in the audience, but I think generally in this community in Prince Edward County, uh, it's very much a majority settler population, and I'm sure that the people who have read the book and as you travel, speaking to groups and to people, you're talking to people who maybe are connecting with this information and these stories for the first time, and they want to do something, right? Like, it's like, what can we, where do we go from here? Um,
There are lots of things that people can do, but primarily, I think one of the most important things is to question what you think you know about residential schools, and take responsibility for your own education about the subject matter. And once you do that, and once you sort of approach the subject matter with an open mind, you'd be amazed at the number of people who reach out to me, readers, and say, I won't be the same. I just never knew about this, but now I'll never forget. And people saying, everybody should read this book. Well, there's lots of books that everybody should read, but with the objective of really questioning what we've been told in terms of the colonial take, the history through the colonial lens in terms of residential schools. And so I know a lot of people, have trouble with the word privilege, because when you say privilege, people think, or people respond as though you're saying that they've had no challenges in their life, or they haven't had to work hard for their achievements, or those kinds of responses to it. But to me, that's not what privilege is. Privilege is when you don't have to struggle against your heritage in order to achieve something in your life, that you don't have the obstacles that Indigenous people face in terms of trying to make a life for oneself. And so in terms of what settlers can do, use that privilege. Use that privilege to make space for Indigenous people. Use that privilege to speak the actual truth about these schools. Use that privilege to influence politicians that are, running for office in your jurisdictions. There's so many things, and there's a couple that lives in Victoria that donated a house in, what is the name of that neighborhood? Oak Bay. It's a very sort of ritzy neighborhood in Victoria, and they donated their home and property to the Friendship Center, the Indigenous Friendship Center in Victoria. They donated property in the Maritimes somewhere, I can't remember where offhand, to one of the First Nations out there, giving the land back. And, there's all sorts of things that people can do. They can donate, for example, to the Residential School Survivor Society. They can participate in things like the marches that happened on Canada Day. It was so amazing for me to see, so many non-Indigenous people wearing orange shirts and standing up on Canada Day. Those things don't go unnoticed, either by Indigenous people or by the people who are in positions of power and influence.
so does it feel like things are changing? Like, does it feel different?
Yes and no. Yes
Yeah.
and no. I mean, I'm old enough. Like, I was 18 when I first started working with Indigenous organizations, and that's right around the time that this book starts, like the
Mhm.
early to mid 70s. And so I know that at that time, if an Indigenous person graduated high school, it was cause for province-wide celebration, right? Provincial Indigenous organizations would honor that person and would support them and encourage them, because it was so rare. And and so I have seen the incredible renaissance that has occurred since that time. But we're still fighting the same kind of issues. We've got Mr. Trudeau, standing up there, every child matters, right? And support our Indigenous people, bloody, bloody, bloody. Okay. But at the same time, his government is fighting Indigenous children in court, and has been for, like with the child welfare issue that is going on right now. 20 years he's been fighting a decision that came out, or the feds have been fighting a decision that came out of the Human Rights Commission.
Yeah. 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 Yeah, well, it is. I mean, that's the
There's
thing.
the talk, there's the talk, and then there's the walk, right? And maybe one day the walk and the talk will sync
Well,
up.
I definitely think that, your contribution, the efforts over those, that near decade that you spent writing this book is such an important, um, I guess, like it's a tool. Like we in the county here, our school board, and here at PCI, next year will be the first year that there's an Indigenous Studies department that's like on par with, like, math, science, English, and it's like it's the young people where, like, let's have them read this instead of, I don't know, Kurt Vonnegut Jr. or whatever.
Oh, you can read Kurt too. He's
You
very
can
good.
too. I mean, but there's lots of, but I mean, that's one of the things that makes me hopeful is to know that stories like this are going to be
Emerging. Yeah,
theirs, you know?
yeah,
um, which is amazing. All right, I'm going to
yeah.
look at some of these questions here. Thank you so much for your time, Michelle, for spending here with us in the county. Ooh, what is Michelle's opinion of the new governor general?
Well, I have two opinions. One of them is woohoo. She is an amazing woman. She is an amazing, accomplished, brilliant woman. She was the ambassador for Denmark. Um, she was the head of the Inuit to Pirasat and deeply involved in the circumpolar work with Inuit people from, North America, Greenland, and Europe, like places like Finland, where the Sami are, virtually like Inuit people in Canada. And so I think that's really brilliant for her as an individual. On the other hand, and it's just sort of my weird brain that is doing this, is that the Governor General is the Queen's representative in Canada. And so to me, there's a bit of a conflict of interest there in the sense that, it is the Queen with whom we entered into treaty. And, the Queen is the crown. Okay, we have the crown in Canada. And it is the crown that continues to refuse to meaningfully resolve the failure to live up to their agreements with Indigenous people. And so I see it as a conflict of interest, but at the same time, I'm delighted for her. And I
Right.
believe that she will do a fantastic job. So,
Hmm. Hmm.
yeah,
Hmm.
yeah,
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess we will see how it all plays out, but
yeah, yeah,
yeah, I think it's definitely uh, something that obviously people have latched onto as a symbolic thing, but it is, as you say, quite complicated
yeah,
in terms of representing those both of those roles. I guess a
right.
little further in terms of the kind of contemporary questions. Where do you think we are as a country in terms of addressing the Truth and Reconciliation Report? I mean, I think I know.
Nowhere.
uh,
I'm doing a lecture series at Green College at UBC. It's a graduate school college at UBC, and there's a lot of conversation about reconciliation and so on. And I looked at the Yellowhead Institute did a really interesting report on where are we at, this very question, where are we at in terms of responding or fulfilling the calls to action. 9 of the 96 have been addressed. And all of those 9, okay, are one-offs, okay.
mm,
Funding the arts, okay, so they put some money in there. Just sort of things that took one thing to do.
right.
None of the things that deal with addressing systemic racism or systemic inequity in, RCMP or the government generally, or, education or health or whatever. None of those things have been addressed. I mean, it's pretty shameful, really. And, as it relates to the final recognition of these unnamed burial sites that are finally being identified, in 2015, well, there are 5 calls to action, 71 through 76, that appear under the heading of missing children and burial information. And in those calls to action, the commissioners basically gave the federal government a roadmap for how to address this issue of these missing kids, kids that went missing and died at residential school. And they did nothing. It was Harper, who was president,
Mm.
who was prime minister at the time. But, you know, the following year, Mr. Trudeau took over and he's done nothing with it either. And it's almost as though nothing gets done unless it blows up in the press. And, you know, but I do think that, you know, the elevation of the issue of, you know, the children that passed away and are missing is a reckoning of a kind. And that, to me, I see that as the truth part of Truth and Reconciliation. There has to be a reckoning of the truth before there can be reconciliation. So if this moves that forward, then I'm very happy for it. But we're not doing so great right now.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I hear you on that. And yeah, I mean, thank you for this. And you're working on your next book right now, you said?
Yeah.
Can you give us a little taste?
Sure. It's also historical fiction, but it goes back further. This time it goes back. It's based loosely on the life of my great grandmother, and I love it. There's this certain kind of I can't think of the word right now, but she was born in 1856 and I was born in 1956. So I love
Okay,
that.
like serendipity.
Yeah, the serendipity or the synchronicity or something of that, right? And so, but she never saw a non-Indigenous person until she was in her late teens, maybe even 20.
Wow.
And so what we have in her character that I'm drawing on her, but it's, you know, a largely fictionalized character, is a pre-colonial Indigenous woman. And so I am writing her story from the
I think you're
she's
breaking up a
the
little,
niece
Michelle.
of chief speaker who was the chief who right occasionally. Okay, don't worry. Am I back? Am I back yet? Am I back
Okay,
yet?
yeah, that's a bit
Can
better.
you
Yeah,
hear me yet?
yeah.
Am I back? Okay, I forgot to say that happens occasionally because I live in this postage stamp sized town. So,
We
but
understand. That's one
anyway,
thing
so
we definitely feel too.
yeah, so yeah, Chief Big Bear negotiated Treaty 6, which is partly in Alberta and Saskatchewan, and there were additions in that treaty that weren't in other treaties until that point, and this was my great grandmother was her niece, so she was there when the Frog Lake so-called massacre happened. And that was coinciding with the Métis resistance at Batoche and so on. And so it's about those very, very troubled times, but it's being told through the lens of the indigenous lens on history, as opposed to the colonial fairy tale that has been told. And it's a very interesting action-packed story.
Okay.
And but it also addresses where the foundation came from that has made it acceptable in Canadian society to murder Indigenous women. How did Indigenous women become disposable in this country? And the book is going to address that just through the life of this woman.
Wow. Okay.
And somebody asked a question here if I could summarize Five Little Indians for people who hadn't read it yet. And so I will do that. I can do that briefly. It's the story of 5 residential school survivors. It basically starts once they leave the residential schools, whether they run away or they're released and so on. And it's about how their lives unfold afterwards and the challenges that they face in trying to make a life while dealing with, you know, a tremendous psychological burden. basically that's it. Starts in the late 60s, goes through to the 90s. So late 90s, actually early 2000s, I think. So yeah, in a nutshell.
Well, thank you. I mean, it's, if you haven't read it and you're still here at the end of this conversation, then I really hope that you do pick it up. And if you have read it, I hope that we've gained a little bit more insight into Michelle and the background of the book, and also just enjoy it as much as I have, spending time with you, and just you made me, I'm not nervous anymore.
Oh,
I
there you
feel
go.
totally good.
I'm the one that's supposed to be nervous.
I know, but, you have to do this probably like 5 times a day or something. I mean, has it been ringing
Well,
off the hook for you? Like, I mean, it's
I did 13 interviews in one day.
wow.
Because it wasn't just the Governor General's Literary Award. I was nominated for 3 awards in one day: the Amazon First Novel Award, the Governor General Literary Award, and the Kobo Emerging Writer Award. Like, the nominations all came, and just that in itself became a story. And it's just been bonkers. It's starting to ease up a bit now, which is great, because um, I need time to write.
Right. Yes, that's right.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's
but
a whole other skill, right? To do all the
yeah,
promo, publicity and stuff. It's a whole other part of
yeah,
your brain.
it sure is. And the book won all 3 of those prizes. And
Yeah.
yeah, and so I mean, that to me, and I think I may have said that, but I've said it so many times, maybe I didn't say it, but that's what the awards mean to me, is that they raise the profile of the book in the Canadian consciousness. And every time another person picks it up, I keep thinking there's another heart and mind that may expand and become more compassionate in their understanding of this um, legacy. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Um, all right. Well, that seems like a good place to say goodbye and good afternoon. Thank you to everybody in the audience. Thank you again to the library for bringing Michelle here. And I hope everybody has a great day. Thanks again, Michelle, and hope to see you again sometime. Maybe in person we'll run into each other.
Wouldn't that be nice? And I'd like to thank everybody that joined us today too. And I really would like to thank you for embracing my book and for being courageous enough to jump in and open your mind to it. I really appreciate that. So everybody have a great day, and thanks, Lenny. It was good.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you. Thank you so much. Goodbye,
Okay,
everybody.
take
Bye.
care. Bye bye.